Erika Harold, the Republican nominee for Attorney General. We appreciate you being here today and invite you to start by providing an opening statement as to why you think you're the best candidate for this office.
Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. I believe I'm the best candidate to be Illinois' next Attorney General because I have the judgment, leadership abilities, and the priorities that will be able to reform the state and be able to get the Attorney General's office to be a watchdog that holds both parties accountable. I'm originally from Champaign-Urbana, where I was born and raised, and graduated from the University of Illinois and Harvard Law School. My legal career has focused on complex commercial and civil litigation and some constitutional law issues. Also, I've been involved in prison ministry efforts, anti-bullying efforts, and criminal justice reform efforts. Additionally, I am on the Illinois Supreme Court Committee on Equality, and I'm a commissioner on the Illinois Supreme Court Commission on Professionalism. These opportunities have given me experience and some insights into some of the inequities within Illinois' legal system and the justice system, and give me some innovative ways to better use the Attorney General's office to be an advocate for the interests of all Illinoisans and to be able to be someone that can hold both parties accountable. When I've been traveling around the state campaigning, people throughout the state talk about the importance of having an attorney general that will use the office's full measure of authority to combat public corruption and to be able to address issues of the opioid epidemic, criminal justice reform, workers' compensation reform. And I've highlighted those priorities because we want to be able to use the attorney general's office in a way that's not partisan, but that really strikes the right balance of protecting the interests of all Illinoisans. I'm excited about the opportunity to do this job, and I can't wait to get started.
Okay, great, thank you. This is the first time this office has been an open seat for a number of years, about 16. How would you rate the job of the current Attorney General, Lisa Madigan, has done?
I think that Lisa Madigan has done a good job with respect to consumer protection issues. I think she's done a good job highlighting some of the predatory lending issues and identity theft issues that have faced Illinoisans. I don't think that she's been proactive enough in the issues of combating public corruption. The office does have statutory authority that can be used to conduct investigations when allegations of public corruption occur, and I think she should be more aggressive in doing that. I also don't think she's been aggressive enough in highlighting issues of criminal justice reform. Right now, our state spends a lot of money incarcerating people, but we are not seeing the enhancements in public safety that I think we should. And so I think you need someone to bring an innovative approach to criminal justice reform and to try to involve all the relevant stakeholders in that conversation.
Is there a specific incidence of public corruption that you thought should have been investigated that wasn't?
Yes. A couple of years ago, there was a patronage hiring scandal within the executive department, and there was an inspector general report that set forth evidence of misconduct, and that evidence pointed to systemic issues of patronage hiring. And that evidence actually triggered, under the State Officials Ethics Act, the ability of the Attorney General to be able to conduct an investigation. And she chose not to do so. I believe that she should have chosen to use that authority to be able to conduct an investigation to find out why this kind of systemic patronage hiring had occurred. Because part of the issue of addressing public corruption in Illinois is finding out why we have this systemic problem. It's not about one party versus the other. Unfortunately, public corruption in Illinois has been a bipartisan problem, and at some point we want to get to the root issues.
Okay. Under the priorities list on your campaign website, your number one priority was listed as enforcing consumer protection, environmental, and anti-discrimination laws. Why is that your first priority?
One of the things I've highlighted is the importance of fulfilling the office's statutory responsibilities, because the Office of Attorney General, the Attorney General is required to have enforcement authority over a variety of statutes. And so I think before you move to the discretionary components of what you'd like to accomplish as Attorney General, you want to first and foremost make sure that all of the statutory obligations are being efficiently and effectively fulfilled, because you're the only legal officer that's situated to be able to carry out those responsibilities. You also have statutory responsibility to address issues like the Charitable Trust Bureau, to enforce compliance with the Freedom of Information Act and the Open Meetings Act. And so all of those statutory responsibilities would be my number one priority, because that is your chief responsibility under the law.
You'd also, during your opening statement, brought up opioids as something you'd like to combat. Why is that something you think the Attorney Generals should be championing?
The opioid epidemic within Illinois is a public health crisis that requires additional resources and visibility. In 2016 alone, nearly 2,000 Illinoisans lost their lives to opioid-related overdoses. That's nearly 2 times the number of people that were killed in fatal car accidents during that year. And during the course of my campaign, I've held roundtables in communities throughout Illinois where we've talked about the way that the opioid epidemic is affecting communities throughout the state. And there are differences with respect to treatment, with respect to facilities and accessibility and prevention mechanisms. And many counties are using their own approach, some with varying degrees of success. And I think that you need a statewide official to highlight this to be able to better leverage some of the best practices. I also think you need the Attorney General to talk about ways in which the criminal justice system can be reformed to better respond to some of these public health issues. The Safe Passage program is a program that has been successful in many communities. And that's a program where people who are suffering from addiction are able to go to law enforcement and to seek assistance getting into treatment without necessarily having criminal responsibility associated with that. And I believe firmly that we need to expand those sorts of opportunities because we need to recognize that we can't incarcerate our way out of this problem, that this is an issue of addiction where we have to be willing to look at treatment opportunities. And so the Attorney General's office has a very unique platform because you are a statewide officer that is charged with dealing with justice issues under Illinois law. And you have a unique opportunity to bring stakeholders together that may not ordinarily collaborate. You're able to bring states' attorneys together. You're able to bring social service providers together, and you're also able to highlight for young people, for example, some of the dangers associated with synthetic opioids, and that it's the synthetic substances that are causing the spike in the overdoses. So I think when you have a very visible platform like that, you want to use it to its full measure and to make sure that you're able to highlight those issues where people would be looking for leadership.
You've brought it up a couple times now, so let's talk about criminal justice reform, something you talk about frequently. It's something you've been involved with several initiatives. You named a couple organizations you're involved with. What type of criminal justice reforms are you going to advocate for, if Attorney General?
One of the types of reforms I'd like to see is enhanced use of what are called problem-solving courts, so drug courts, mental health courts, and veterans courts. And they give judges enhanced discretion to be able to, during the sentencing and the trial phase, to take into consideration a host of other circumstances that would weigh into the totality of someone's life. And it gives judges discretion to decide, for example, if a diversion program would be more appropriate than incarceration. And I think that right now we're starting to see evidence that reduces recidivism rates in communities. It allows them to save money. More importantly, it helps to infuse our criminal justice system with more human dignity and giving people second chance. And for the past 11 years, I've been on the National Board of Directors of a group called Prison Fellowship. It's the nation's largest outreach to inmates and their families. And we've been involved in trying to forge a bipartisan consensus on the need for criminal justice reform. For too long, this issue's been viewed in almost a partisan light. And that means that gains can be undone if there's a change in who holds that position in a particular party or in a particular state. And we need to reach a consensus where both parties agree that it's important to move forward on those measures because it is the way that we start to see enhancements in public safety and giving people those second chances to be able to reintegrate into their communities and be able to have housing and job opportunities.
How do you get there, then, from it being seen as a partisan issue to building a bipartisan coalition? How would you work to bring those sides together?
One of the things that Prison Fellowship has done that's been very effective is to highlight the areas of commonality where people can agree on specific legal issues and trying to avoid conversations about issues that aren't central to reform. And so Prison Fellowship is able to get groups like the Heritage Foundation and the ACLU to be involved in criminal justice reform measures. And when you focus it on the specific problem to be solved and the gains to be inured to the entire community, then you are focusing on it in a way where it's problem solving as opposed to creating political leverage.
And you think you could accomplish that here in Illinois?
I do. I actually believe that having a Republican as Attorney General makes it more likely that we would be able to move the ball on criminal justice reform in Illinois.
How so?
I would say for many years, this issue has been viewed as one that would be adopted more by Democrats. And so then the challenge would be to get Republicans to come on board. If you have a Republican Attorney General that already believes in these core concepts and has experience in not only what works and what doesn't, but in having the conversations to build that consensus, that goes a long way towards bridging that gap. And it's an area where having a Republican in the office actually would be useful, because I'd be committed to doing everything I could to build the consensus to get those measures adopted.
Moving on to something else I've heard you talk about, you said you want to expand the Attorney General's office's investigative tools. What type of tools are you looking at here?
The Attorney General should have the ability to convene statewide grand juries and to be able to issue subpoenas in greater circumstances, because without those investigative tools, you are far more limited in your ability to be able to respond to allegations of misconduct and to be able to be more proactive. Right now, the Attorney General's office does have some authority to initiate investigations, but those are under very limited circumstances, and I think they need to be expanded.
Are there specific instances you'd like to see them expanded to include, since they're so narrow right now?
I think that it should be expanded beyond just what the State Ethics Act would limit. I think it needs to be where, if you do see evidence of public corruption, you do have the ability to conduct an investigation.
Okay. Kind of brings us into one of your more recent ads. Involves your opponent, Kwame Raoul, and House Speaker Michael Madigan. Talks about how they've teamed up to raise property taxes. You note that Madigan's law firm represents many powerful corporations and people on their property tax appeals. And the ad says, kind of ends with you saying, as Attorney General, you will make sure the politicians pay for corruption. I would argue that saying corruption implies that something illegal is being done. What you've described in that ad is not illegal. So what do you find wrong with this practice that would make you want to look into it?
Right, it's an inherent conflict of interest where you have a public official setting policy related to taxes and then also having a business where the profit is gained based on people hiring you to appeal some of those very policies. And I believe that the law should be changed to prohibit public officials or legislators from representing clients in front of property appeals boards. Right now, Illinois law currently prohibits legislators from representing clients before the Court of Claims and the Workers' Compensation Commission, and that is because there is a recognition of the inherent conflict of interest that exists when you're both setting policy and representing clients. And I believe that those same principles apply with respect to why it's a conflict of interest for someone to be involved in setting tax policy and then reaping a profit from representing people with respect to some of those same policies.
Okay. Do you think, what are your chances of succeeding at doing that if the House is still controlled by Michael Madigan while you're Attorney General, if you're elected?
Hopefully the public will put pressure on members of the General Assembly to change this practice. When you look at the property tax rates right now that continue to increase, it's one of the reasons why a lot of people find living in Illinois no longer affordable. And my opponent has been in Springfield for 14 years and has not initiated reforms to try to address that system, and in fact did serve as the chief sponsor in the Senate while Michael Madigan was the chief sponsor in the House of a piece of legislation that would have allowed the city of Chicago to raise property taxes above the statutory cap. So not only was he not involved in initiating reforms that would have had a meaningful impact in the lives of Illinoisans, he was partnering up with Speaker Madigan to allow additional taxes to be raised.
Governor Bruce Rauner has said he personally recruited you and is funding you. If you win and he's elected to another term, how can voters be sure you can operate independently from the governor?
There were a lot of people who encouraged me to seek the office of Attorney General. In fact, when I was running for Congress back in 2014, there were a lot of Republicans who said that they wished I wasn't running for Congress. They wished that I was running for Attorney General instead. And so there were many people who encouraged me to run for this office. And I would set forth guidelines within the office itself to delineate when I would take action and when I would not. And those would be based on legal parameters, constitutional principles, and have nothing to do with partisan interests. And so voters could count on me to be able to hold both parties accountable and to be able to offer an explanation as to why I took one action versus the other.
Okay. Can you give us, I guess, some examples so far of how you've, I guess this is where we hear a lot of, is that you are the governor's candidate. Can you give us some examples of how you've operated independently of the governor?
I could give you a lot of examples of ways in which we have disagreed on issues and where I have publicly stated that. One example is on the issue of marijuana. The governor does not believe that marijuana should be legalized. I do believe that our current policies do not work, and Illinois should pursue the process of legalization for adult use in a prudent way. And I think that that would be in the best interest in terms of giving Illinois economic benefits. I think that the opioid epidemic is a far more urgent crisis and therefore requires the law enforcement resources and tools. And so I take my positions based on what I believe to be in the best interest of Illinoisans.
The governor has said, though, he'd like you to prosecute Speaker Madigan for corruption. He's also giving your campaign a significant amount of money, including a $1 million donation. I'd argue that having a sitting governor support you financially while publicly saying he wants you to go after a political nemesis could be called corruption. So if you were elected and you did pursue Madigan in some way, how can voters be sure you didn't pursue him because of a financial donation you received?
Well, running for office requires the support of people within your party, and my opponent, Senator Raoul, has received $1 million from J.B. Pritzker. So both of us will receive contributions from people within our parties, and the contributions I've received certainly have not come with any conditions. And at the very beginning of my campaign, I talked about how I define public corruption, and I talked about the importance of holding both parties accountable. And I would set forth again the principles and parameters under which I would choose to take action. And I've always emphasized that taking on public corruption is not punishing political opponents. It's talking about rooting out a system of embedded conflicts of interest and entrenched political interests. I would take issue with the fact that my opponent has been in Springfield for 14 years and has taken no action to try to stand up against some of these speaker's agenda items that have been harmful to people within Illinois, whether it is voting to allow Rod Blagojevich at the time to skip pension payments or voting to raise legislator pay. He has not been willing to exercise the level of independence that we would expect from somebody within that office.
Can you remind us then your definition of public corruption, since you said you've been defining it early on? Can you remind our readers and viewers of that?
So there are a couple of things that I believe constitute public corruption. One is breaking the law. That obviously is public corruption. Then there are elements of self-dealing and conflicts of interest, where the system itself has elements of corruption within it. We've highlighted the property tax issue because that's an arena where, in other contexts, it's specifically prohibited under Illinois law and should be in the context of property tax appeals.
Okay. I guess talk to us broadly, moving on a little bit, but still in the same ballpark, who you receive campaign contributions from. Are there any you've refused?
There are a couple of contributions that I have returned for various reasons, but I receive a lot of contributions from people that support me online. I've received contributions from various Illinoisans and people who support my campaign. Obviously, the governor has contributed to my campaign, as has the Illinois Republican Party. But on the issue of receiving contributions, I've been disappointed that my opponent has not refused tobacco contributions or contributions from people affiliated with tobacco companies, because right now the Attorney General's office is involved in administering settlement funds related to tobacco litigation. To me, that is a conflict of interest and contributions that should not be accepted.
Have you then not taken any from tobacco companies?
No, I have not.
Can you tell us which ones you've returned? You said you've had to return a few.
There were a couple of individuals that I returned as a result of allegations of misconduct.
Can you specify?
And I don't, and I'm not necessarily looking to highlight them. They were voluntary choices to do so, and I chose to do it and to make contributions to charitable organizations. I think each one of us has to define for ourselves the kind of standards we would set. I can give you one example, Representative Sauer. I believed once those allegations became public that it was appropriate to return that contribution. Nobody called on me to do it, and I'm only disclosing that at this time in response to your question, but that's just a personal choice to do that.
Okay. Have you taken any from public utilities?
I believe I've received a couple of contributions from public utilities, but my opponent is clearly their choice, according to Crane's article, and he's somebody that will not hold them accountable. And during the course of his career in the legislature, he has voted to raise consumer rates, and I think there's a reason why he is receiving contributions from them probably at the rate of 10 to 1.
You said 10 to 1 rate?
I believe that's accurate.
Are the amounts you've received from them are they small? Is there a reason you haven't returned them? Because we'd argue the public utilities is also another area the Attorney General will have significant work, or would be working with significantly, or holding them accountable. So are those contributions you would ever consider returning?
I don't believe they pose the kind of conflict of interest that the tobacco settlement litigation would, because right now the Attorney General obviously plays a role in policy, but the Attorney General plays a role in policy in a wide variety of arenas. The issue comes when you're dealing with litigation involving a particular company or a particular entity.
Okay. The Me Too movement has gained steam in the legislature this year, and in May you issued what you deemed were what sweeping changes that you thought needed to occur. Walk us through what those changes are and why they're needed.
The underlying priority would be to make sure that the system itself is independent. And right now, the system still requires the Ethics Commission, which is comprised of legislators, to be the ones to be the trier of fact, to be the ones that determine what punishment would occur, and to also be the entity that decides whether certain subpoenas can be issued by the Inspector General. I believe that level of control by the General Assembly puts members of the General Assembly in a position of essentially being the trier of fact with respect to their colleagues, and would make it much more intimidating for a potential victim to report allegations of misconduct against a legislator. And the fact that the General Assembly still has not instituted reforms to provide for that level of independence and transparency, I think is unconscionable. And my opponent has been there for 14 years and should have been someone who was calling for greater levels of independence and transparency. And the fact that that position of Legislative Inspector General sat vacant for nearly 3 years again goes to show the lack of priority with which the General Assembly has addressed these issues of sexual harassment.
Shortly before the primary, and this was after you came to our edit board in the spring, so we didn't get a chance to ask you about it then, There were anonymous sources that told some Chicago area reporters that during the 2000 Miss Illinois pageant, you said it would be better to place a foster child with a conventional family with an abusive past than to place the child in the home of a stable same-sex couple. Did you say that?
As I've repeatedly stated, I do not recall that exchange.
Okay.
But if I did state it, it's wrong, and I would in no way defend it. As I've also stated, that is not my position. I support the right of same-sex couples to be able to be parents and to be able to be foster parents, whether adoptive or foster. And I think it's terrible that my opponent continues to run an ad that would attempt to mislead voters into thinking that that is my current position. And aside from the politics, it's fear-mongering. It's trying to make people think that somehow I would discriminate against their families when I have been unequivocal in stating that I believe that same-sex couples should be able to be foster parents and should be able to be adoptive parents. And I think that he should stop running an ad like that that attempts to mislead people. I think it's also telling that that was the very first ad that he chose to run of the general election. Because if you'd been in the legislature for 14 years, you would think that your first ad would be about something that you had accomplished for your district. It would not be about some anonymous allegations of something that I am alleged to have said almost 20 years ago when I was 19 or 20 in a pageant.
We noted here, at least, the timing was interesting right before the primary. We also did note it took you a couple days to respond personally to the allegations. In hindsight, would you have handled the way you responded differently?
I did respond personally. I can't control when various news entities chose to run interviews that I gave. I felt it was important to respond personally because I want to give assurance to people that that's not my position.
What is your stance now on same-sex marriage?
It's the law of the land.
Do you support it?
I think that we have to move forward. It's the law of the land, and I would do nothing to undo that.
But I mean, do you personally support same-sex marriage?
I believe that we should abide by the law of the land.
Okay. Another social issue that voters have been care about is abortion, especially the last year here in Illinois with the signing of HB 40. Do you think abortion should be illegal?
I'm pro-life. That's not something that's a secret to anyone, but it's also the case that I believe in enforcing the law. With all issues, I believe that it's the job of the Attorney General to defend Illinois law, and that's what I will do.
Okay. There have been a number of Attorney Generals from around the country, including Lisa Madigan, who have challenged the Trump administration in court over various issues. Are there any circumstances in which you would challenge the federal government in this capacity?
Absolutely. Anytime the federal government exceeds the scope of its constitutional authority or takes an action that conflicts with Illinois law in an area where Illinois has the primary jurisdiction, I would not hesitate to challenge them. So to give you a couple of examples.
My next question is that, so go ahead.
For example, I believed that the attempts to withhold law enforcement funds in connection with the Trust Act was unconstitutional because the Trust Act was written in a way to comply with federal law. If you read the statute itself, it specifically says that it's to be interpreted and construed in a way that complies with federal law. Therefore, there's not a constitutional basis for withholding those funds. And so I would have actually taken action sooner than Lisa Madigan did. Her first action was to file an amicus brief in a related case, but it wouldn't have sought the resolution of the specific issues related to Illinois. I would have sought a declaratory judgment much earlier that the Trust Act complies with federal law and that therefore there's not a basis to withhold those federal funds.
Okay. Key part to the Attorney General's office, at least to us, is ensuring the Freedom of Information and Open Meetings Act are not being violated by other governmental entities. How would you hold them accountable?
I think that the public access counselor needs to have more resources and personnel allocated to it because in talking to a wide variety of people who have filed FOIA requests, they talk about the backlog. Mm-hmm. And part of the power and potency of the Open Meetings Act and FOIA is the timeliness of being able to get that information. I believe that if you have to wait a couple of years to get an advisory opinion, by that point, it's a moot issue. And so that is an area where I would advocate for additional resources. And I think that the office should also consider issuing more binding opinions, because a lot of the opinions that are issued are non-binding. And I think that issuing more binding opinions might make public entities more cognizant of their responsibility and probably a little bit more willing to offer the information necessary in a timely manner.
I can see that. You sometimes see a lot of advisory opinions that are very similar.
Right, and I think that the binding nature of it really is where the Attorney General's office has more power to, even within the current resource limitations, to be more forceful in that arena.
Yeah. Where would you seek the additional resources for in order to get the PAC funded better?
I would advocate that the General Assembly allocate additional resources, but to the extent that would not be forthcoming, one of the first things that I would want to do is look at the entire office itself to make sure that the resources that are currently allocated to that office are being used as efficiently and effectively as possible.
That was my next question about what type of resources in general do you think the office has now, and what do you think you would need to provide to run the office you think needs to be run?
I think that many tasks that the Attorney General has statutorily require a great deal of resources. And so I would look to see how we could make better use of technology to perhaps free up some of the staff resources that are used in answering and responding to certain questions each day. I think right now the website does need to be modernized to provide more forms online and greater information to people so they're able to look and perhaps get some information online that they might otherwise need to call a staff member. And so looking to see how you can free up more staff members' time, I think is something that would be important. But I think that's why I emphasize the importance of fulfilling the statutory responsibilities first, because prior to addressing issues of discretion, you have to make sure that you are fulfilling the mandates that only your office is able to fulfill.
What else, if anything, that we haven't covered here today so far, would you want voters to know about you?
I would want voters to know that I understand what it's like on a personal level to feel powerless and marginalized. When I was in high school, I was the victim of severe racial and sexual harassment, and that harassment persisted for about 1.5 years, and administrators were not nearly proactive enough in working to protect me and to provide a safe environment. And as a result, I was ultimately forced to transfer from that high school and move to a different high school. And that was my first major experience feeling marginalized and feeling that because of my own background that somehow I wasn't deemed worthy of being fully included. That experience was also what led me to become an attorney. I wanted to acquire the skills necessary not only to be able to advocate for myself, but also to be able to advocate for other people. And as a result of that experience, I've worked in the arena of preventing youth violence and bullying and have sought to find ways to better protect students from harassment to make sure that they feel safe within their school environments. And I would want people to know that because I'd want them to know they'd have an attorney general who understood what it was like to feel powerless and would recognize how important it is to use the office of attorney general to stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves. One of the tools and the obligations of the Attorney General is to find those areas where Illinoisans need someone to stand up for their interests collectively in ways that it would be inappropriate or difficult for individual Illinoisans to have to stand by themselves.
Do you think there's something you could do as Attorney General to help with bullying in schools? I mean, that's certainly
Absolutely.
Certainly continues. It didn't stop when you graduated high school.
Absolutely. There are a variety of things I think the Attorney General can do. One is to provide more information for parents about what their rights are under the law and what schools are supposed to do in terms of the policies in place. To also provide a checklist for parents in terms of the kind of questions to ask if their child is being victimized in some way, and also to better equip parents with the kind of documentation that they should be keeping if there's an issue of harassment, to tell them to specifically request a copy of the school's anti-harassment policy, and to specifically ask who is the intake person within your school that's designated for students to report incidents of harassment. I also think that the Attorney General can highlight issues of cyberbullying, because with the advent of social media, cyberbullying becomes a huge challenge, not just for schools, but for parents and communities, because if a student posts something on social media at home with their home computer, a school may not feel like they necessarily have recourse to actually take any action against that student. But what happens on social media is going to have a huge impact on the entire course of the student's time there. And so I would advocate for schools to use their honor code and extracurricular activity opportunities as a way to encourage students to be good ambassadors and good stewards of those public social media opportunities.
Well, we appreciate you meeting with us today, and we invite you to give a closing statement as to why you believe you should be the next Attorney General for the state of Illinois.
As somebody who knows what it's like to feel powerless and marginalized, I would bring that experience to the Office of Attorney General to be able to be looking for ways in which I could use the office's very visible platform to be able to stand up for people. I would also be somebody who would be an outsider, who I've never held elected office, and so I don't owe anyone anything. I would be able to stand up and hold both parties accountable. I would be willing to try to challenge Illinoisans to demand more and expect more from their government. I think for too long we have just been willing to send the same people back to Springfield over and over again, and somehow thinking that we would see different results. And my opponent has been in Springfield for 14 years and has not demonstrated any independence from his party, has not demonstrated independence from Speaker Madigan, and during the course of this campaign is not running on what he's actually accomplished for his district. Instead is trying to sow fear among Illinoisans about me. But if you look at the track record on how I've spent my professional time, I have been an advocate for making sure that people are treated fairly. The Illinois Supreme Court Committee appointed me to be on the Illinois Supreme Court Committee on Equality. The Illinois Supreme Court appointed me to be a commissioner on the Commission on Professionalism, where we specifically look at some of the issues of inequity and lack of access to justice. That's how I've lived my adult life. That's how I've spent my professional career, and that's the kind of Attorney General that I will be for the people of Illinois. I have a record of which I'm proud to run on, and that's why I'm running for Attorney General. And I would hope that during the course of this campaign, my opponent would at some point say what it is he's proud to have accomplished during his time in Springfield and run on his own record.